World City Studio. We've got two more following. One is on pedagogies and one is on alternative imaginaries in this area. So the seminar series has taken us really through the breadth of the different sort of work we're doing in the City Studio. So quickly to introduce, before I talk about the seminar, my name is Rihoux. I'm the director of the Center for Urbanism and Built Environment Studies, CUBES, here in the school, and also coordinating the City Studio, but with a wonderful team. So it's very horizontal organizing of work here. Yes, so the Kelvin-Alexandra-Frankenwald City Studio is an initiative we started in 2023, but properly and launched in 2024. It runs up till 2026. At least that's the plan at the moment. And it addresses an area of extreme inequality within Johannesburg, with wealth in close proximity, with impoverishment and real deprivation in terms of the built environment. And therefore, it really allows us to explore critical challenges of urban inequality and spatial injustice, and the reproduction of these characteristics and their intensification. And at the same time, researching ways in which this course can be changed. Our topic today relates directly to that question of reproduction. The topic is social relations in the Kelvin-Alexandra-Frankenwald City Studio, the reproduction of the apartheid city and its contestations. And we've got two wonderful presenters here. Both of them are working on these topics for their PhDs and therefore really going into a lot of depth. They are our colleague Paul Devenish here in architecture, who is, he joined us last year in the school, but has a long history as a practicing architect in housing, education, healthcare, and public environment. So he brings all the practical understandings with him. And his particular interest is in the City Studios, examining boundary making and shared infrastructures. And in particular, his work imagines boundaries or reimagines boundaries as what he calls cognitive interfaces. And with that, he's challenging inherited divisions and through ground up practices of city making. And this is very beautifully complemented by Quentin Rihoux' work. Quentin's also an architect, but has degrees in planning and urban policies as well, and is a PhD candidate, in fact, in geography at the University of Lausanne, and he's an intern in CUBES. We were fortunate to have him here physically the first few months of the year. And his work is at the intersection of political economy and cultural theory. And his work hinges on this worldwide shift, urban planning and the development discourse from plan to project, or in other words, the projectification of development, and the spatial implications of this and for urban politics. And he's particularly looking at Johannesburg and Paris. So very, very interesting. And at a later stage, we'd love to have him present a seminar on that comparison. Here we're focusing on his case study, which happens to be in our City Studio area. And then we'll have two discussants. Both of them are online. One is Prof. Pushpa Arabindoo, who's an associate professor in geography at UCL, University College of London. She's also an architect by training from Chennai, and the urban design and an urban design at Pratt Institute in New York. And she also did her PhD at LSE. And she continues being embedded in a way in Chennai. I think that's possibly where she is right now. And her research is on middle-class politics, subaltern activism, and ecological challenges within the global South and Southern urbanism debates, and very relevant to what we're doing here. And we're actually collaborating with Pushpa and her colleagues as well in the City Studio. And then we have Christopher Gevers, who's an associate professor and director of the Center for Applied Legal Studies at that is CELS at Wits. And he's published widely in international law and held fellowships in Oxford, Cambridge, Harvard law schools. And why we asked Gevers, Christopher Gevers in particular for this to be a discussant is that he participated in the litigation in domestic and international courts, including the first prosecution on the crime of apartheid. And he'll probably give us a little bit of context to that when he comes through a bit later with his comments. So with that, it's over to, I think, Paul, who will be starting off. On the screen, by the way, our slides, just to show those of you who perhaps haven't been in the previous seminars, we float these slides at the beginning. To the red circle is where the city studio is located in relation to the income disparities in Johannesburg, darker areas being where higher incomes are concentrated, the black line being the mining belt, and the north of that, the watershed, continental watershed. And the images on the right are from our mapping initiative, which involved drone footage, among other techniques. So very fresh, up-to-date footage of these disparities. To the far top of the top photograph, one sees the vacant land that is currently being developed, that is Frankenwald, and the view is from Stjwetla, the informal settlement, which is along the Rihoux River, and which will feature as well in Paul and Quentin's presentation. Thank you. Okay.
Thanks, Marie, for the introduction. Before I start officially, I think it's maybe useful just to describe Quentin and I and how we met and how we're working on this together. So as Marie mentioned, Quentin was doing some field work in Johannesburg at the beginning of the year. At the time, we realized that there's an overlap in our science, and there's also a strong overlap in some of the theories we're applying. So we developed a sort of working paper together, which we presented in August at a conference, RGS 2025 in Birmingham in the UK. And what we're going to show you today is an expanded version of that presentation. And which also the work that we're showing includes much of the work of our PhD. So the research that we're presenting today is titled Spatial Relations, the Reproduction of the Apartheid City, and it really explores the buffer zones around Alexandra, Johannesburg, and focuses on how ambiguous spaces where borders meet, intersect, or overlap, and how both these spaces, these interstitial spaces, both enable urbanization, but also remain entangled in long histories of colonial and capitalist systems. So here the term border is more than just a national border. It refers to urban territories or demarcations and separations. And it really is the legal and material edges that together form a border assemblage in cities, which I'll expand on later in the conceptual framework of the research and presentation. So while borders mark and separate territories, they are not inert lines. To understand the life of borders or edges, we first turn to Simone's concept of surrounds, which he describes as the contiguous overlapping interstitial spaces that borders create or that occur in between territory. These surrounds reveal the active, often unexpected processes of urbanization that borders both constrain and enable. Thinking with surrounds helps us move beyond borders as fixed lines to understand the messy composites they generate, spaces that, though often marginalized and contested, are central to urbanization. Similarly, we draw on the work of Caldera, whose work on peripheries shows how liminal or edge zones generate new forms of social life, organization, and political mobilization, and how urban edges or margins can act as generative spaces of becoming. So to understand these dynamics of urban emergence, we first draw on assemblage theory, which treats borders as complex, adaptive, and entangled entities. Our focus here is on the relationships between borders and the emergent potentialities that derive from the way they interact. This framing allows us to approach these in-between spaces not as gaps or margins, but as sites where things emerge, where new urban activities come about. While debates around assemblage theory often cite the density of its jargon or the open-endedness of its claims, as in Brenner, 2011, and in the work of Scott and Storpet, 2015, our research adopts a relational ontology to understand processes of becoming. This means we apply assemblage theory not merely to describe the complexities and specificities of what a place is, but to use this understanding to assess its capacity, what it might become, and how this informs many of the spatial injustices at play in the present day. So, following on Brenner, we therefore situate assemblage theory within a critical urbanist approach to account for power dynamics and processes of subjectivation, investigating previously neglected aspects of capital urbanization. For example, the way in which projects recompose political, economic, and power structures, and how they emerge from an interscalar complex of relations. Stated in another way, border assemblages comprise nested territories and demarcations, multi-scale material and environmental fabrics and geographies. Together, they behave as lively infrastructures that retain memory, that can recast and recompose political power structures that control and regulate the flows of people, capital, materials, all across multiple scales in the city. Mbembe defines borderization as a process by which the world's powers permanently transform certain spaces into places impassable for certain population classes. He goes on to say, the border is simply a visible part of larger measures and installations that have been constituted in response to the question of what to do with the flows of waste. That is, with the surpluses of humanity, of which the fleeing and the stray fraction. To understand how such processes take shape, we draw on the concept or the notion of nomos after Mbembe and Schmidt. Described as the material, cultural, environmental, and importantly, legislative devices through which borders are cast. Nomos captures the brutalism of these forces, the ways in which politics, ecologies, and material structures gather, thicken, and harden as territorial borders. It is this larger installation of boundaries and edges and other systems of spatial designation that we refer to as the border assemblage. Building on post-colonial thought and drawing particularly on Fanon, we read this coloniality of the border as a mechanism that captures both land and labor, the spatial technology that secures domination through the regulation of movements and access. In the Southern African context, beyond apartheid, these colonial border logics persist in new forms of processes of borderization that continually capture land and recast laws that determine who may occupy, cultivate, or belong. Following this logic, our mapping process retraces the emergence of in-between spaces around Alexandra through processes of legal and physical demarcations of territories and borders. Drawing on archival and cadastral records, we analyze various legal, surveyed, and material processes through which dominion is established in a colonial landscape. We further inform this analysis through a tracing of historical aerial photos to identify practices of land cultivation, borderization, and development before, during, and after apartheid. And we follow processes of land transfers, subdivisions, and rezonings alongside policies, legislations that recompose controls on the tenure, occupation, and adaptation of land. We document overlapping borders and relational effects, tracing how segregation was implemented in apartheid, but further how practices of separation continue in the present day. Through field observations and semi-structured interviews, we then examine the lived experience of these border assemblages and the way in which inhabitants of these border areas have subverted them through acts of inhabitation, occupation, and through processes of subsistence and autonomy, while borderization processes continue to cast and shape new forms of separation. So with this outline I'll now turn to the historical roots of Alexandra's spatial configuration. In the late 19th and early 20th century, Johannesburg's mineral or gold boom drove rapid colonization, a series of South African wars, and the establishment of racialized and labor systems. Farm boundaries formalized dominion and regulated land ownership through various regional land statutes that assumed a right of occupation and that generally designated the separation of land tenure rights along racial lines. Alexandra emerged from this context as part of the Stjwetla farm, which was subdivided initially in 1905 in larger allotments for white settlement and recast in 1911 with much smaller land parcels for black residents as a result of its poor proximity to town and unfavorable wetness. This in the wake of the 1913 Natives Land Act and the resulting constraint on opportunities of land tenure it brought. This also marked a densification of Alexandra in this period, given the limited options available for urban settlement for non-Europeans. What is crucial here is the legal and material basis upon which land was captured and classified under colonial rule. According to Jeremy Foster, 2008, the 1913 Act can be read as an extension of the 18th century Enclosures Act in England, laws that privatized and commodified vast areas of communal land. This ideology of enclosure, built on the control of land, labor, and resources, traveled through the empire and was embedded in local legal instruments. In Southern Africa, the Glen Grey Act of 1894 in the Cape Colony and the Langdon Report of 1903 for the ZAR Native Affairs Commission set the conceptual groundwork for the 1913 Natives Land Act. Though the Langdon Report was not itself law, it articulated principles that would guide later policy, restricting specifically communal land allocation in settler areas and severely limiting private ownership by non-Europeans. Both documents rested on the false but stated assumption that large areas of land in the country were unsettled and therefore available for appropriation by European settlers. At the same time, these statutes acknowledged existing forms of communal land rights and customary law, but confined them to so-called reserves, effectively codifying segregation. With the formation of the Union of South Africa in 1910, these legal frameworks were consolidated into a national system that fused racialized tenure in territorial governance. The agglomeration of state borders and the ratification of regional land tenure laws and frameworks thus created the legal foundation upon which property rights, subdivisions, transfers, and title deeds continue into today. As gold production intensified and in the wake of the growing nationalism leading up to the Second World War, the 1920s through to the 1940s sees a steady gathering and hardening of territorial borders and the securing of land rights through the country. This is particularly demonstrated through the institution of the 1927 Land Act. Zooming in, Alexandra's edges became sites of economic and institutional separation. Dynamite testing at Klipfontein supported mining and wartime operations, which you can see on the top right-hand side of this image. Wits Frankenwald property was donated to the University of Witwatersrand for education purposes. That is also at the top of the image. And plantations and agriculture, and plantations and agricultural cultivation expanded along the northern and eastern edges, while agricultural holdings, which you can see on the bottom left, were subdivided and sold, supporting urbanization and densification close to the city for white residents. With the formal institution of apartheid in 1950, Alexandra's surrounds continued to be aggressively reconfigured. Surrounding areas were declared white only and were further subdivided and sold to entrench their claims of tenure. The Alexandra Health Board was established to assert control over and regulate subdivisions, subletting, and street activity. By the late 1960s, industrial buffer zones were established, which you can see in purple in the label Weinberg Industrial, on former white-owned agricultural holdings to the south and west of Alexandra. A practice we see today, the conversion of agricultural holdings into industrial areas as devices of segregation. Highways also codified separation, while forced removals and hostels reshaped population dynamics of the area. In the 1970s and early 1980s, anti-apartheid struggle and demands for economic independence intensified. Spatially, the M1 highway was completed to bypass Alexandra. You can see the bottom piece of the M1 was initially meant to run along Louis Botha Road, but was taken further west to move further away from Alexandra. A large landfill was imposed east of the N3 highway. You can see on the right-hand side of the Yxke River landfill dump, and continued rezoning reinforced tenure structures. You can see a large growth of the purple indicating a growth of industrial areas into the 1980s. In 1980, the Alexandra Master Plan was introduced, which partially reversed demolition plans, introducing phased upgrades, large-scale residential units, and long-term leaseholds, although temporary housing was largely excluded. While on the far east bank, selective demolition and rebuilding produced a mix of income-based and elite housing as part of a neoliberal shift towards the ending of former apartheid. So with this, I'll hand over to Quentin, and he will take us through the rest of the mapping.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to share my screen. You have to stop sharing your screen, Paul, I think, for me to be able to share mine.
I'm trying to figure out. I think it's stopped.
Yeah.
Perfect. So here we are in 1986. So facing an intensification of the liberation struggle, the apartheid state came up with a counterinsurgency strategy called Winning Hearts and Minds. And in Alexandra, this strategy meant not only reinforcing police presence and imprisonments, but also implementing a new security and urbanization strategy. And this strategy materialized in the urban renewal proposal, which aimed to divide the population into different social groups and get effectively the black elite and middle class positively adhere to the reform in exchange of various types of retributions. The main retribution was the concession of land on the east bank of the river to make the home ownership more easily and rapidly available. And several areas of the project were built by private developers in order to limit the involvement of the state and to put the responsibility of upgrading on the property owners themselves. At the same time, the council considered the proposal considered the council responsible for the poor, and so shacks that were standing in the way of the renewal scheme were demolished, and squatters were moved to a temporary transit camp called Stjwetla that you can see here, right on the north of Alexandra. So in 1980, the mobilization led by the Alexandra Civic Organization eventually managed to stop the project, and the 4 years of struggle and negotiation before the formal end of apartheid resulted in further land concessions. Notably that of the Frankenwald estate, so belonging to Wits University, for which a first plan was drawn, that you can see here on the map. What's also interesting is that it's not only a concession of land, but also a concession of program. So the land was allocated to low-cost state subsidized housing. And interestingly, at the time, decision makers at Wits University were very proactive in selling Frankenwald to the Regional Service Council because they feared that the end of apartheid would lead to the expropriation and redistribution of their land property. But after apartheid's end, even if one might have expected a rupture, instead, compromises of the transition period were materialized, some of them, but apartheid geographies were also reproduced. Um, so with mainly the RDP, the Tutumani village for the All Africa Games and later the renewal project, the Alex renewal project from 2001 to 2010, the ANC extended Alex into the Far East Bank through private development, mixing low income and middle class housing. But at the same time, large industrial and commercial zones like Limbro Park and Long Meadow rose on the other side of the highway. And two attempts to develop Frankenwald were blocked in court, which effectively stopped Alexandra's expansion beyond the Far East Bank. The first attempt was blocked by the communities of Kelvin and Buccleuch, by their resident association, to protect their property value against the construction of RDP. And the second attempt, the second main attempt, was blocked in 2004 by the Mia Trust, who was developing the Waterfall estate and wanted to protect their commercial interest. So the result of that is that for many impoverished black residents, a form of apartheid persists because despite the demolition of half of the slum, and so many of them are excluded from new housing developments. And at the same time, the newly built train line called Gautrain, which is unaffordable to them, cuts through the remaining interstitial space and reinforces the border between them and the last piece of land with potential for redistribution. Here you can see a picture with the embankment of the Gautrain. Now, from 2010 on, there is a well-documented shift of the national housing policy towards mega-urban projects. This puts on hold subsidized housing and land provision in the area, and it is accompanied by a rapid expansion of informal settlements. So first with the construction of shacks in the backyard of the newly built Far East Bank, the squatting also of the Marlborough Industrial Buffer Zone, and the expansion of the Stjwetla informal settlements towards the north, so towards Frankenwald. And in 2016, the Frankenwald land dispute gets solved, and due to a conjuncture of different factors, like the rise of land occupation, the fees must fall movement at Wits, and the policy alignment to Gauteng and the planning department of Johannesburg, the development project restarts. And this implies a reinforced security around the estate and the sale of the land in 2024 to private developers, to two private developers, Calgro M3 and Eris Property Group, for mainly, so who are developing a project for mainly middle class and elite housing, as well as industrial and offices development. Now, zooming in on the interface between Stjwetla and Frankenwald help us understand and reveal how the tightening of interstitial spaces is recasting neo-apartheid spatial relations in the post-apartheid city. So looking at the evolution between 1994 and today, what is striking, or what we first see, is that the informal settlements in pink have largely expanded. So both as an extension of the pre-existing Stjwetla informal settlement and within the former apartheid buffer zones. And second, that this happened along the multiplication of new borders that are not only material, but also assemble topographical, statutory, and social components, such as gates, embankments of the Gautrain, privatizations of land, and the policing of what now forms what can be called a continuum of gated enclaves around Alex, around the greater Alex. And this process has effectively tightened the interstitial spaces in green, spaces that are now smaller, more fragmented, and increasingly difficult for poor Black residents to access. And what interviews with Stjwetla residents show is that the everyday experience of this tightening echoes what Fanon observed in Alger as three specialities of colonization. Let me explain. So first, the experience of compartmentation with a clear polarization, both in discourses, but also in aesthetics and in planning processes, in urbanization processes between the planned Frankenwald development, but one could take as an example also other developments happening currently in the area. So the polarization between the formal development process and incremental informal settlements like the Stjwetla settlement. And second and third, the experience of being encircled and immobilized. And this is best explained by an activist of Stjwetla who says, Black people of Alex, they have to be cramped within, whereas the richest mile of South Africa is right across the street. If you move from here to there, you'll find boom gates, security guards. There's no free movement, especially when you're Black. In a nutshell, we're still under the apartheid system. But while the tightening of interstitial spaces has recasted these neo-apartheid spatial relations, the subjectivation of these relations by the inhabitants of Stjwetla has also re-intensified conflictuality around land redistribution and urban futures. So this is what we try to show on this last slide. So something emblematic for us of this strategy is the strategy of land occupation. In 2017, a group of a few hundred landless people of Alex formed and revived this old strategy by occupying the Frankenwald estate, trying to, and they were swiftly repressed. But these failed attempts led them to retreat into the interstices to occupy a piece of land now called Maponiaville. A participant of the occupation explains. It's where we go back to Maponianeville. Maponiane, I think they demolished 7 times. The first time you are scared of the guns, you are scared of the law enforcement and everything. They come for the second time, up to the 6th, 7th time. In fact, it even makes you to fight back. We ended up fighting back. There were a few arrests, but then ultimately it stopped. Instrumental in the success of this occupation was the support brought by the EFF, who intervened to fend off the police. And this support led many of the occupiers to join the EFF party and led the occupiers also to name their settlement after the EFF leader, Maponiane. And since then, these occupations, they crystallized in varied transformations of the interstitial space. So I will give a few examples. So setback from the border assemblage, Maponiaville became permanent and stands out as an alternative mode of urbanization to formal development projects. The space was designed on the spot with no division between intellectual and manual work. Collective and communal spaces were deliberately set aside, brick and cement used for permanence, and together these choices gave the neighborhood a very clear architectural and urban quality. But that said, as you know, the lack of basic infrastructure like water, electricity, sanitation, combined with overcrowding has already deteriorated living conditions in the area quite sharply. And closer to or within the border assemblage, where constructions have not withstood evictions and demolitions, residents have adapted by establishing more temporary uses of space, such as sports field, food gardens for autonomous food production, and common public spaces, such as park. I can show you here a few pictures. So here is the football pitch, the food gardens, and the community park. And finally, what's so interesting is that the practice of land occupation did not disappear despite consolidation, but was reappropriated by the EFF in the following years in what one could name an ongoing struggle for land redistribution as the construction of the Frankenwald development project is starting. I now move to the conclusion slide. Paul, the floor is yours.
Thank you. As shown in our presentation, Alexandra's surrounding buffer zones have been historically produced through the gathering and casting of legal, material, and social borders. Following the formal end of apartheid, these border zones continue to tighten around land, housing, and private development interests, reproducing many of the logics of enclosure first articulated in colonial land statutes. Through an iterative analysis of planned projects and unplanned settlements converging in this interstitial terrain, notably at Frankenwald, Stjwetla, and Alexandra-Kelvin-Frankenwald, we demonstrate how the proliferation of new enclosures reanimates the nomos of apartheid, the juridical and spatial ordering of who may occupy, cultivate, or belong. Yet the very practices deemed informal, collective occupation, communal land use, self-built development, and cultivation may also be read as counternomic gestures, grounded experiments that unsettle the legal and material basis of exclusion. These practices do not merely resist formalization, but propose alternative modes of spatial order and legitimacy. In this light, Greater Stjwetla can be understood not simply as an informal settlement, but as a living archive of another possible law or nomos, one that emerges from occupation, reciprocity, and shared land stewardship rather than private property and exclusion. We argue that as interstitial spaces tighten, conflict around land redistribution and urban futures intensified. But so too does the possibility of new political subjectivities and spatial justice to emerge from within these contested surrounds. With that, I thank you for your attention and would value any inputs, questions, or discussions.
Wonderful, thanks very much. And I hope those of you that have been here throughout the seminars are seeing a continuity of how the topics are being explored. Some of this will be picked up in 2 weeks' time in the last of the seminars that we're having here in the room, and will be taken further in our exhibition on the 28th of October. Just that to flag the sort of bigger tension in which this seminar, tension. Yes, so over to Pushpa then for to start off, kicking off with comments. So we really looking forward to hearing what this sparked in you. Thank you.
Yeah, no, great. Thanks for that. I think it worked very well together in tandem, and obviously you both probably have rehearsed it very well, or it's a very convincing narrative that complements your own research interests in a wonderful manner. So one of the things that I'd like to kickstart as a commentary is that I'm dialing in from Chennai, where I'm here for a land use conference organized by the State Planning Commission to think about what kind of shifts we need to see in terms of land use approaches for better sustainable futures. And I came here to this conference ready to critique the way in which we emphasize through planning this whole preoccupation with uses. And I was pleasantly surprised to see the way in which implicitly, subtly, and sometimes even overtly, not just policymakers, but not just academics, but even policymakers dropped their focus on use and were really targeting how we talk and debate about land. So in that sense, your paper has this politics of land as an underlying element of framing to the debate. And I love the way in which you took a historical approach and historicized it. And in many sense, it's not just historical, but it's genealogical, right? What you're trying to establish is a genealogy of how the spatial reproduction of settlements such as Alexandra and Stjwetla extends over a time period. But since you've chosen to use this lens of assemblage, I wondered whether you could challenge a little bit this linear narrative, linear temporal framing that comes a bit too neatly. And sometimes, we can do it spatially, and you've demonstrated that quite well. But I wonder whether the same thing can be done to disturb the temporal linear narrative that's there in your presentation. So that's one point of comment. The second thing is just in terms of pushing some of the theoretical framings that you laid out in the very beginning of using borders versus boundary making, and I wondered whether how do you see borders and boundaries differently? And there is what is the land regime that is here? Did it begin from? Of course, it began from an agrarian. Agrarian focus, then it became a bit more urban. And in the Indian context, what a lot of the counter narratives try to do is to go back to pre-colonial forms of land regimes, and you find that that's equally exploitative. So is there a pre-colonial, pre-settler narrative, even though a lot of the land documents probably start from the colonial period? So is there any value to the Black narratives to think in terms of pre-colonial modes of land regimes at all? So that was my point relating to your temporal framing. And then the third thing is in terms of clarifying a little bit the transition periods. When you talked about the 1970s and the 80s, there seems to be a little bit of confusion in terms of, is this neoliberal, then is this apartheid neoliberal different from the post-apartheid neoliberal? Why is the neo-apartheid imaginaries so similar? Why does it echo and resonate with the apartheid approaches? Is there a way of explaining some of these tactics that continues to be reproduced? And when you talk about this internal dynamics, I think some of the social science framings of citizenship, when it's attached to tenure, could come into play. So in terms of what sense of a propertied citizenship, and can you talked about land subdivisions, and in fact, in this conference that I attended today, one of the things that we were talking about is to resist land subdivisions, right? How can you think of land without thinking about it through subdivisions? And yet, we are constantly perpetuating that same temptations. Do you have the same thing, not just with the middle class and the elite Black communities and members, but also I think the newer communities who are moving into the interstitial spaces, I would suspect that there's a similar reproduction of land subdivision practices happening there as well. And in relation to that, I wondered whether, you use the word autonomous quite a few times. Alex Vasudevan has written a lot about autonomous city. And do you see some resonance and with that kind of reference that you see from Alex Vasudevan's work, which is quite Eurocentric, but it brings some legitimacy or it brings some clarity to the way in which we think about squatting and other similar practices in the European context. And then finally, what I wanted to ask you is also the way in which you've used borders and using assemblage. You kind of want to turn the border into bordering as a complex fuzzy tactic. But that doesn't happen only at the boundaries, right? It's not just a redlining exercise. The borders scale in and scale out. And so I wondered whether whether you could push yourself to think in terms of the internal dynamics within the settlement itself. What kind of, there must be temptations of property making, which means that people are constantly marking boundaries internally as well, and whether you were able to capture that within the settlement, particularly through the mapathon exercises that Mary did a few weeks ago with her studio. So, it's not just about redlining of settlements and capturing the interstitials, but the interstitious scales internally as well. And there are internalities to boundary making exercises, which also shows that there is we can't read these settlements as singular entities. So there's a risk of crumbling, a sense of identity, of them crumbling and falling apart. But that's the challenge when you use assemblage as a filter as well. So I think I'll leave you with that provocation and, or rather, counterpoint to your presentation. Thank you. I really enjoyed it. Thanks a lot.
Thanks so much, Pushpa, for that rich response, also bringing in the Chennai context and directly from a land conference, the debates and so on. So all very, very current and relevant here as well. But before we ask Paul and Quentin to respond, I think Mr. Gevers can come in with his comments. And just to mention that we've got a couple of rows of from Stjwetla, residents from Stjwetla who are vested in various ways and also keenly interested in particularly the seminar. I think title drew quite a large group, and so I hope we'll be drawing into the discussion just now. Thanks. Over to Christopher. Thanks.
Thanks so much, and thanks for the presentation. So let me begin with the caveat, which is, and an apology in some senses, which is that I'm a lawyer, right? So what I'm going to say will focus on the legal aspects to some extent, and worse than that, I'm an international lawyer, which is not even a real lawyer. But I really enjoyed these presentations, and it really sparked a couple of points of connection, perhaps, that are not always acknowledged between the legal basis of apartheid and its relationship to the material and the social. So I guess what I wanted to tease out a bit, because law was a central part of the narrative, is the account of law as a means of the reproduction of injustice and spatial injustice that runs through the thesis, and really to highlight, I guess, some echoes between what I understand your central provocation to be, and a debate within law, amongst lawyers, amongst international lawyers in particular, around what apartheid means. What is the role of law, and how does law relate to spatial and material injustice, right? So to sort of set that up, there is you could say, two ways of understanding apartheid in international law, right? So there's the one that we get, which various scholars have called the liberal understanding of apartheid, in which apartheid is a state-based, institutionalized, formal discrimination, right? And here we can think of the Group Areas Act, or we can think of the Native Land Act. So these are direct acts by the state to divide up the population for the purposes of domination, but largely focus on doctrinal and other forms of intervention. But there's a much richer, more complicated way to think about the relationship between law and apartheid and also resistance, which comes through the tradition of Pan-Africanism and in particular the role of African states at the UN during apartheid and trying to craft a thicker understanding of what apartheid meant and the role of law in its production and its reproduction. And the sort of I guess the index of this is the Apartheid Convention. And so where we sit today in South Africa and in the world is it really a war between these two different understandings of apartheid, which is important and particularly for your thesis, because on the first version, if apartheid is just sort of formal discriminatory measures driven by the state, then apartheid begins in 48 and ends in 94. If we take seriously the tradition of apartheid that thinks of it, and I want to borrow your language here, so the understanding that apartheid is a nested assemblage, a thicker understanding of the relationship between law and the production of injustice along racial lines, and we take that from the Apartheid Convention, we get at least three, I think, points of connection to what you're trying to do and that broader tradition of thought around what apartheid is. So the first is temporal. Right. So under the Apartheid Convention, there's a deliberate effort I can cite the references, but in the preamble and throughout and in the drafting history, to not exceptionalize apartheid to South Africa, but to link it to colonialism, right? So the temporality of apartheid as a legal problem doesn't begin in 48. It begins with colonialism, and in other fora is linked also to enslavement and broader structures of white supremacy that emerge within modernity, right? And you point to this as well, that you can trace back the Native Land Acts into the 19th century. We could go further. You could go back to, for example, the acts that emerge at the moment of emancipation at the Cape, which also used law as ways of trying to re-enslave the formerly emancipated in 1834, following emancipation in their short period of apprenticeship. Right. So the Apartheid Convention reckons with apartheid in the longer temporal frame, which I think is precisely what you're trying to do, as opposed to an account that begins in 48 when it's formalized legally. The second, and perhaps more important, is that the definition of apartheid under the Apartheid Convention is not just direct acts of discrimination or even direct acts of violence. So, and I'll read you just one section of that. So apartheid is understood in the Apartheid Convention to include, and it's a deeply spatial analysis, any legislative measures or other measures calculated to prevent a racial group or groups from participation in the political, social, economic, and cultural life of the country, and the deliberate creation of conditions preventing the full development of such a group or groups, including the denial of the right to leave and return the country, the right to nationality, the right to freedom of movement and residence, the right to freedom of expression, and the right to freedom of assembly and association, right? So what you see there is a thicker understanding of apartheid that sees it as not just the question of direct discrimination, but domination in all aspects of life, right? In the spatial, in the material, in the social, in the cultural, in the political, economic, and otherwise. And that thicker understanding of apartheid as a legal understanding, right? So not simply an understanding of a structure of domination in which law plays a minor role, but as law is producing the conditions for political, social, economic, and cultural domination, I think resonates with how you've understood apartheid and borders in much more complicated terms than simply lines on the map, right? So I guess on that point, I'm suggesting that there's an echo to what you're trying to do and think in more nested ways about borders. You can think in more nested ways about law as well through the Apartheid Convention. And the third, and I guess this is to thinking about the continuities, the third point about the Apartheid Convention is that the obligation it places on states is not just to end apartheid laws, but to eradicate apartheid, right? So under the first definition, when you repeal a law, when you take all the apartheid statute, there's 17,000 odd different measures introduced under apartheid to racially distribute land, for example. When you take those off the statute books, you've ended apartheid. Under the Apartheid Convention, it ends when it's eradicated, which would include all of its subsequent manifestations, including through horizontal acts of private actors. So through the acts of universities, through the acts of developers, all of these parties are bound by the obligation to eradicate apartheid, which is a very different thing from saying one must repeal apartheid laws. So I say all that because I think that in the way that you're conceptualizing borders in more complicated ways, and law is doing something in that story, that you can also sort of reach or extend, I guess, the way that you understand in more complicated ways borders to the way you understand the role of law and the production, not just as alongside the material and the social, but really as as I said, a nested assemblage of legal interventions and other measures that produce the social and the material injustices of apartheid as well, beyond simply the demarcation of borders or the direct discrimination by the state. Thanks.
Thanks, Christopher. Thanks for that that particular angle, which I think is incredibly stimulating for us to hear, but also important. And I think bringing in that term of eradication and what it really means and what the obligations really are, and that this isn't just an academic exercise, but in a way, charting a way towards that eradication is really something that's desperately needed. And hopefully, yeah, our engagement with this area can in some way contribute to that. So over then to Paul and Quentin for responses to this before we open up, and hopefully we'll have some questions online and in the room. Yeah.
Shall I start? Quentin, you happy for me to jump in?
Yes, yes, you can.
Okay. So, Christopher, thank you very much for that insight. I think it helps me think about a lot of how I want to use what we're doing, because this is really a small piece of a much bigger piece of research. And I think the question I have at the back of my mind constantly is, you know, if many of the legal structures of apartheid that sort of affect very real spatial configurations are embedded in much older practices, and there's a kind of necessity and obligation to kind of eradicate apartheid beyond simply the dismantling of those legal structures, then it's useful to go back to some of those very old legal systems. And that's why, specifically in the presentation, I mentioned and pulled in the link to enclosures acts and acts of kind of the removal of folks of communal land. And that's something I think, well, that my supervisor, Richard, has pushed a little bit, is kind of like, is looking at the different ways in which land is governed by more than one person, collective mechanisms of governance, collective processes of custodianship over land. And I think, and this is sort of, as I mentioned at the beginning of a process, but I think there is something interesting there around sort of reframing how we define land tenure in urban systems. And within the sort of a South African context, there's also a sort of there is a fuzziness that comes about as rural areas become urbanized, because there are traditional land law systems that then are confronted with urban land ownership systems. And I think that confrontation of or the fuzziness that results from something that's that it can be a powerful lever for us to really challenge what is deemed legitimate forms of living in the city. And so I think that's very useful, and the points you've given me, I'm going to go dig through them. In terms of Pushpa's comments, Pushpa, there's a few questions. I'm just trying to think how I want to go through them. I think what you talk about as one of the problems of the method of research is something I'm deeply aware of, is how do you present something? You know, there's a linear process, there's a story that you unpack. I think the intention in my mind, or the critique at the back of my head that I have around the work I'm doing, is to what extent the maps show very straight, delineated lines, even though the theory is critiquing the linear nature of the border, and the way in which the historical narrative is also unpacked in a time-based sequence. What I think is that ties very nicely to your question about ground-up processes of boundary making, internal processes of boundary making, and I think that's very much what this desktop component of the research is meant to support, is to sort of trace what archives and historical maps say is a reality, but then to contrast that with the realities of how people are making borders and how there are variations within that. There's different ways in which land is being shared. There's different ways in which private land parcels are being designated. And I think if the field research that is still to come about in my part, Quentin's already busy with his field research, but my field research is kind of what I'm hoping comes out of that is a counter narrative that contrasts against this historical linear mapping that I've shown. There's a few more points that Quentin, we can jump over to you, and I can come back to some other notes if we have time.
Yeah,
Yes,
thank you.
Quentin.
Thank you, Pushpa, and thank you, Christopher. So it's food for thought, and it will be. Yeah, I think I will continue to think about this as I will start to write this piece together with Paul. I don't have answers on all of the questions, obviously, but I had maybe one or two comments or reactions. The first, Pushpa, you said, okay, how to break with a linear genealogical way of presenting or explanation, and I think it's also something that I was thinking about while I was drafting the narrative of the presentation, and it's true that staying in this linearity for us, it was quite comfortable and quite obvious because it helped really to show yeah, what we wanted to demonstrate, the historical continuities, to emphasize that. But in fact, I agree with you that what we are explaining, it's more a subtle and more complex mix of continuity and rupture. So how to deviate, how to present things in a way that is less linear is something I would like to dig into, especially because yeah, it's maybe with a more creative way of presenting, or that avoid this linear progression in time. That is also maybe something of the rationale, the planning rationale that we try to critique as a in its modern and colonial components. And then you talked about literature on citizenship, and you mentioned the concept of autonomy, and I'm not familiar with the literature that you were mentioning. I just wanted to tell you which literature I'm taking as a reference when I'm talking of autonomy, and it's a northern literature. It's a work of Antonio Negri, and also of the French philosopher Jacques Rancière, who defines, who worked on the topic of politicization. Because the topic of my research is the evolution of planning rationals, and this shift from schemes or from plan to project to a project-based planning is often seen as or reduced to the neoliberal transition. And it's often said that this shift provokes a depolitization of spatial relation. It's really not something that we can observe empirically in such context, and so to try to I think Rancière, his definition of politicization explains very well what's happening empirically. He says politicization, it's the act of removing spaces from the grip of systems of mediation, and in these spaces to directly link a local problem to the global articulation of social relations. So, for example, to take the problem of a lack of housing, or a lack of land, or of means of subsistence, to, in this case, the colonialism or capitalism. And that's what happened. So the story that we are presenting. It's also the story of this the removing of so the appropriation of a space and of the politicization that went along that. And yes, a last comment, but it will be very naive comment because actually I don't have answers to that, but I find it very interesting. So how you said how to think of land without thinking of division, and at this stage I'm almost wondering if it's the right question to ask, or if the question to ask is it's not how do we divide and for what do we divide for? In fact, because if you look at how, and I think maybe it's the case of many other informal settlement, but the way that the Maponiane village was designed, it was with occupiers taking a tape measure and going in the space and asking, okay, you are a family of four people, you need that many rooms, so we cut you a unit of that and that meter, and we draw a line, and then we need another unit here for you with that many rooms, and then we need a street, etc. So it's a way of dividing in fact, it was a way of dividing the space, but that was completely different from the way that usual planning processes divide the space. First, because it's not mediated by the abstract space of the plan. I think that's important. So there is no so this process of dividing space is not transform into a kind of a technical process that requires an expertise. It's not done done by the people themselves, and it's done without a division of. So what I said during the presentation of between intellectual and manual work. So it's the people who will use this space who are directly involved in the process of dividing the space. And that's what makes me think that, and here not talking about the legal status of property and the legality of space division, but this process, the inhabiting space and urbanizing, it goes through processes of land division that are not necessarily only problematic, and that's all I can say at this stage. I didn't yet do an effort to theorize on that, but yeah, that's how I feel about this problem of spatial division. Thank you.
Thanks, both of you. I've also taken rich notes, and I know that we'll be in the City Studio discussing all of these further, besides taking a lot of it forward in the remaining seminars. Yes, so opening it up now to questions. Anybody online? Can we see if there are any hands online? None at the moment yet. What about from the room? And I know some people in the room were directly involved in the process that Quentin was talking about the formation of the Quentin, for instance. So many demolitions, and we've also had an interesting process of trying to find trying to come up with a map that provides the names within Stjwetla. Stjwetla's large and complex, and it's very interesting how some of the names of areas are actually names of places within those areas, and we need to resist drawing boundaries around these places. There must be another way in which these place names are known without boundaries. And yet there does seem to be a line that's overstepped from one area into the other. And having some of the patrollers in the room with us, is very relevant because they're the people that navigate the space with names and needing to know if someone calls from a particular place, where that is and where it ends and where it starts. But yes,
Marie,
Priscilla has a question. Yes.
I don't know if I have a question, a little bit of a comment. I'm Priscilla Izar, I'm a researcher also at CUBE, a postdoc at CUBE. Sorry for my sunglasses, but I forgot my other glasses. Well, first I wanted to say congratulations to both of you for the work. You know, it's really great to see two PhDs meeting, I don't know, like 6 months ago and working together. But yeah, so really interesting, rich presentation and incredible mapping. And I can also appreciate very much Pushpa's and Edwin's feedback. Like I think it's very lucky to have that kind of feedback. And I mean, not in such a refined way, but I was also thinking of this more, I guess, perhaps more this top-down framework of assemblages. And I think you're already, especially, well, both of you, even though Quentin is a little bit more reticent now, but I think you're coming up with the bottom down understanding when you talk about my point of view, but you also have, you know, like you're working together with the residents and I think perhaps you can think of a counterpoint. For example, when you're doing your I don't know where you are in your PhD, but if you're thinking about counterpoint, so you're looking at the formation of the territory through maps and laws. But then when you're looking at the formation of Stjwetla, and that's resistance, right? So resistance, you need to go and do interviews, and you guys are already doing that. But talk to those that produce, you know, and then you really have to go to the decolonial scholars as well to understand, to kind of like kind of turn around the research and in a way that's more also more southern, right? And I really think you're already doing that. Maybe you're not reading that literature, but it's really understanding how the territory and how the informal settlements stayed and resisted and even expanded despite all of this pressure to for their eradication at some point. So that was my feedback to you, but I also wanted to ask, it's thinking then in terms of the, and that's a question to you. It's thinking in terms of those resistances, then how does the working point of view and the resistance there relates to the water warriors and just thinking in terms of this practices of resistance, you know, this broader area of the city studio. How do these two activities and locations relate? Is there a relation, a strong relation, a strong identity of resistance, or it's more like two separate?
Want to respond? I see Christopher's hand up as well. We could take Christopher first and then have you respond. Yeah.
Thanks. So I'm inspired by Pushpa's suggestion about the linearity question, right? And I wanted to hear a bit more, if you can, or get you to think a bit more about the role of the developers, right? So the way the story unfolds is mostly around state formation. So the typical indexes of the state, you enclose land, you impose apartheid, it ends formally, and then developers start doing the same thing. This is kind of the neo-apartheid argument, right? That the corporation succeeds apartheid. But if one zooms out, you can invert that. Right? Or you can at least complicate that by saying, actually, a lot of the practices that emerge that later become known as apartheid emerge at the hands of privates, right? So if you go back to the Cape Colony, for example, private individuals and corporations, the Cape's colonized by a corporation, right? The money that follows, so in the Cape Colony in the 1840s, when there's money's paid to white slave owners at emancipation, it quintuples the amount of money in the colony, and you have a lot of white wealth all of a sudden. And one of the things, or two of the things that white wealth does, is start to form the same apparatus and assemblages that you're talking about, right? So it's white slum owners emerge in the Cape, in the city, in the urban areas, as they have to use their wealth to then house people that are now freed and now working as indentured labor or as apprentices in forms of manual labor. So you have the emergence of sort of white dominated slums, not as a state project, but as a private project driven by white wealth following emancipation. And the same is true in terms of the expansion in the Eastern Cape, that it's white farmers that are expanding using the money that they've got from emancipation from the British government. They're using that money to expand the colony eastwards. And again, it's white settlers that are expanding, not the state. The state is in some sense following the expansion of white settlers and the practices that emerge around enclosure there are driven by private actors and then legitimized by the state subsequently, not the other way around. Right. So in some senses, the developers come at the end of your story, but they could also be at the beginning of your story, or they could just be a more complicated relationship between, I guess, the state and private actors, that they don't just arrive in post-1994. There's always this embedded relationship that's kind of complicated and non-linear, to use Pushpa's productive framing.
Yes, thanks.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's very useful. A very useful way to disrupt the linear is to kind of look how certain cycles repeat and when they repeat and how often, how the same thing occurs in different forms and frames. I want to jump back quickly to a question Pushpa had around the distinction between the border and the boundary, and I think it ties into what Priscilla has mentioned to some extent. Look, I think there's a few different definitions and understandings around the word boundary, and I have to say that my particular understanding of it comes from an architectural point of view, where I'm working with boundaries not only as site designations, but internally within buildings, making of different types of material boundaries. And so I have a little bit of a bias when I think about boundaries as something that's not necessarily absolutely a division. The boundary, in my mind, is something that happens as a result of bricks and windows and all sorts of building materials that come together, that come from different places, that assemble through diverse sets of relationships and create moments where people can connect. And in terms of what Quentin's alluding to, the process by which Moponyana is set out in terms of how people share an area of land and where those divisions are drawn, I think that is very much around the ground-up boundary-making process. And so this was something that Quentin and I also discussed a little bit about. Do we use the word border? Do we use the word boundary, edge? What is our terminology? And in this particular paper, we decided to focus on the term border because of the scale of mapping that this part of the project was going to represent. But I think that, if I give you a comment that I made, I think that distinction that I'm making now between boundary and border is very much part of that transition of moving into fieldwork about looking at boundaries as something as a possible counterpoint of border, even though these terms are so closely linked and closely related and kind of from an outside point.
Quentin, would you like to come in? Quentin?
Yes, sorry.
Thinking hard.
Just quickly on the topic of the continuities or the linear narrative. Thank you for mentioning this piece of history and encouraging us to also look at repetitions or practices or urbanization processes of the past that are that reappear today. maybe what will be interesting for us is to see so beyond continuities and ruptures, or beyond continuities and repetitions, how these relations, they are recasted. So how they contain some elements of continuities, but also of the new, because the repetitions, they are never perfect, and these processes, they are also extremely contingent, and this also links to maybe Priscilla's comment on the duality between this top-down framework of assemblage and bottom-up understanding of the resistance. I think maybe it's not something that is completely formalized yet in the presentation. At least, yeah, in my work, what I try to do is to go beyond this duality and to look within formal planning processes, how power relations, struggle, resistance, it's not something that is outside formal planning and top-down planning, but that is always inside them or entangled with these processes, and that in fact these planning processes, they are always also open, and that they emerge from power relation and struggles throughout the whole processes. So to do justice of these struggles within planning processes, and to also say that the planning frameworks, the planning rules, the planning laws, the planning the planning rationales and the tools, they are also the product of these power relations of the past. So it's also a way to reinforce the critique without completely closing the future and the possibilities of the new or of something different. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Maybe something I would interject is that just the discussion is that the linearity, when spatialized in the way that you did, in itself is powerful in telling a very particular spatial story, and that perhaps what is needed is to pluralize or to have that alongside another narrative that disrupts it. But in itself, thinking through pedagogically and kind of how complex this history is, and how complex even just this city studio area is, I've found it incredibly useful having it presented in the way you did today. But I'm really welcoming of all those discussions of needing to disrupt, and I suppose kind of in doing so to get to the bottom of why this reproduction is happening, and why we're not getting towards moving towards eradicating apartheid. And I wanted to say to Christopher that I'd love to discuss. Has Christopher left? No, Christopher's still there. Discuss with Christopher my reading of the right to development within the UN, and I think it's a similar period. Comes from African countries' mobilization around issues against what is now the global North, and their ideas, and how it's kind of most being ignored for a long time. But it sits alongside this convention against apartheid, and I think has a similar requires a similar kind of response. Anyway, quickly open to is there another hand in the Pushpa has a hand up? Oh, it's a very faint hand on the color there. Yes.
Yeah, it's more of a curiosity question based on what Christopher said in his commentary. about ending apartheid laws, but not eradicating apartheid. And as an outsider, I have the reverse reading of what is happening in India, where we kind of ended colonialism, but we often say that the colonial laws, the draconian laws, still remain, like the way in which some of the civilization is used to resettle informal settlements is often based on colonial draconian laws. So I was wondering whether I understood you wrongly, or is it actually a difference in the way ending apartheid is different from ending colonialism?
But we might have missed it a little bit because our internet froze, just as you were saying that India.
Oh, so in India, what we say is that, we ended colonialism, but colonialism still endures, and a lot of the draconian laws, particularly in the way in which we use public health, civilizing questions to resettle informal settlements. And so I wondered whether I had misunderstood Christopher's comment in terms of not, ending apartheid laws, but not eradicating apartheid, and whether it's two different things, that you can end colonialism, but you cannot end apartheid, or you can end apartheid but cannot end colonialism, or it's in terms of whether I'm understanding the dynamics of the two, and mixing them up might not be very helpful as a thinking comparatively in terms of colonial practices and apartheid practices.
No, I mean, I think
Thanks.
I think it's the same. I just think that if one takes a narrow view of what apartheid laws were, then one can say those have been eradicated, right? And we're less likely to invoke them in the way that in India you might invoke a colonial law, just because of the kind of opprobrium that we have around the ones we know, like the Group Areas Act. But with a thicker conception of the role that law plays in the creation and maintenance of apartheid, we haven't got to the heart of what all the laws that do the work, right? So it's not it's a similar point. I guess we do it in a less direct way, but many of the laws that created apartheid remain. They're just not understood as being discriminatory. They've been naturalized in the legal system.
Thanks. Yes, so are there any comments, questions from the room? As people, some of you at least, people living in this context and still experiencing apartheid in the way of my land, nature, my land. Or as Quentin and Paul were saying, is Stjwetla an alternative for the future? And I know I've spoken in depth with Mike, who's here, and who was one of the leaders cutting up Stjwetla and doing it again and again after those demolitions, and cutting it out of a pile of rubble because the first construction was in brick already. And we've spoken about how it is a future or different way of living in an urban space collectively. But this is a conversation that will definitely continue, and sparked by what's been said here today. We're going to have many more conversations. So anyone is perhaps there's something new. Nothing to say at this stage. Okay. Yes. But yes, so we're actually well on time, and wanted to thank everybody for joining us online and in the room, and for our two wonderful speakers, and our very, very incisive responses. And I'd really like the way you complemented one another, from the legal and the more theoretical, and sort of grounded India as opposed to here. Yeah, so thanks very much. It worked for us. Thanks, thank you. I think we should give you guys a round of applause. Yes, okay. Well, these are all recorded and placed on the CUBE's website, the recordings, and Kumo also sends them out to those of you that are on the mailing list. So we'll certainly re-listen to this a few times. But thanks. Okay.
Thank you so much. I'm glad that it worked out. Thank you, guys. Bye.
Thank you so much.